And we begin today's conference with an in-depth discussion about corporate culture, featuring a keynote speech followed by a panel. Recent revelations involving some of Australia's largest companies have thrust corporate culture and the role of board oversight of culture into the forefront of the public debate. No longer can culture be dismissed as a soft issue without financial consequences. Mismanaged culture has the ability to destroy both trust and value. ACSI regards good culture as critical to the long-term sustainability of the companies in which our members invest. This has been and will continue to be a major focus of our discussions with the boards of listed companies when we meet with them. And this is a topic that our speaker, James Shipton, Chair of ASIC, is well qualified to speak on, with his considerable experience gained over 20 years working in regulation, financial markets, the law and academia, in Australia and internationally. James's appointment as the Chair of ASIC follows a period as Executive Director of Harvard Law School's program on international financial systems. And before that, James led the Intermediaries Supervision and Licensing Division of the Securities and Futures Commission of Hong Kong. Before that, James spent almost a decade at Goldman Sachs in Hong Kong, managing government and regulatory affairs for the Asia Pacific and the prime brokerage business. He commenced as ASIC Chair on the 1st of February 2018, at what is undoubtedly an eventful time for corporate Australia and most certainly for ASIC. We are delighted to have you with us here today, James, to share your insights on the role of corporate culture in restoring trust in business. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you to ACSI, Ian and Louise for having me here today. Ladies and gentlemen, I've now been at ASIC for 3 months at a time of intense scrutiny of the financial services sector and its regulation. Timing, as they say, is everything. And this is a fundamentally important time for corporate Australia, especially its financial sector. So after these 3 months, I thought it would be useful to talk about my observations of Australia's financial system and its regulatory structure, the challenges it faces and its future direction. What I hope to do today is present my perspectives as someone who has worked internationally in the financial services sector and as an overseas regulator, and who is essentially new to Australia's financial system. Accordingly, I hope to come to my new role with fresh eyes. And without wanting to preempt the important work of the Royal Commission, I would also like to make some proposals aimed at addressing the challenges facing our financial services sector. My first observation is that what I have concluded so far is very consistent with the observations and recommendations made by ASIC in recent time. Moreover, many of the regulatory responses that I believe should be applied have already been by the actions taken or commenced by ASIC, particularly ASIC's pursuit of regulatory enforcement, prosecutions, and consumer compensation. My observations are also informed by the work that ASIC has been undertaking in recent years to lift standards in the financial sector. They also reflect my strong commitment as Chair of ASIC for ensuring better protections and outcomes for Australian financial consumers. However, regulation and its legislative framework is of necessity continually evolving. This evolution is now accelerating because of rapid changes in the financial sector domestically and globally, often catalysed by technological advances. I will also add that ASIC's work and the focus of organisations like ACSI are complementary. We both focus on corporate governance. this has the benefit of enhancing the long-term value of investments by our community. My observations are also reflective of the important work of the Royal Commission. The Royal Commission has highlighted for the community the costs and consequences of financial services misconduct. Misconduct that my colleagues at ASIC have been investigating and acting on for many years. In particular, the Royal Commission hearings have highlighted the totally unacceptable and widespread practice of charging advice fees when no advice was provided. We were pleased when the Royal Commission highlighted this totally unacceptable practice, which ASIC exposed in a 2016 report. ASIC's own work in this area has resulted in $220 million in compensation to customers, with more to come. The Royal Commission hearings have also highlighted unacceptably poor levels of self-identification, transparency, and disclosure by the industry in identifying, reporting, and dealing with misconduct. This all goes to the heart of a trust deficit facing the financial sector and, more broadly, corporate Australia. This failure of responsibility is jarring for me to observe as someone who prided himself on being a member of the finance profession. I use the word profession very deliberately here, and it is something I will return to. As I just mentioned, Australia's corporations and the finance sector in particular are suffering from a trust deficit. And this current predicament is of the sector's own making. And because it is largely of their own making, the sector must be held account and must take responsibility for its repair. As I've said before, ASIC, like other regulators, have a crucial role to play here too. But ultimately, trust can only be restored if these companies work root and branch to change their ways, to rebuild their culture from deep within. And in addition to the regulatory and enforcement roles of ASIC, it is essential that investors, particularly organisations like ACSI that represent them, focus their efforts on holding industry to account for malpractice, malfeasance, or unacceptable harm to consumers. In recent times, we have seen the important role that investor engagement has played in influencing corporate behaviour. The sustained engagement and active stewardship of assets by investors will be fundamental to restoring trust, better governance, and good corporate culture in Australia. Turning now, in particular, to the culture of the financial services sector. My concern is that many people in finance have lost sight of the ultimate purpose of the financial system. They have forgotten this system is all about managing other people's money. The financial system's purpose is to serve core functions for everyday Australians. I use Professor John Kay's description of the four functions, namely capital allocation, inter- and intra-generational transfers of wealth, hedging and insuring against risks, and the provision of a payment system. But instead of focusing on these functions, I worry that many financial services companies have become insular by focusing only on how they can maximise earnings. Accordingly, the first job of the sector is to refocus on these core purposes, instead of exploiting opportunities to make money from its customers, often to the customer's considerable detriment. This is exemplified by the proliferation of conflicts of interests in parts of the financial sector. Conflicts of interest are a perennial challenge for business, especially in finance, and they are certainly not unique to Australia. Nevertheless, it is clear to me that a number of institutions have not taken the management of conflicts of interest to heart. This is verging on a systemic issue. Indeed, it is the source of much of the misconduct ASIC has been responding to and which is being highlighted by the Royal Commission hearings. The inappropriate sale of financial products in car yards by commission-driven sales force is but one example that ASIC has tackled in recent times. And yet conflicts of interest are not new. So what has surprised me is that many Australian financial firms have turned a blind eye to the risks that conflicts pose to customer outcomes as their businesses grew. They didn't have a management system, a management culture, or codes that were attuned to identifying and resolving conflicts. And there has been a reluctance and oftentimes resistance to addressing conflicts, especially those embedded in remuneration, even when ASIC pointed them out. This resistance has, at times, extended to a reluctance to make good any harms caused by conflicts. Too often, unacceptable conflicts were justified by firms on the basis that, quote, everyone else is doing it, even though it's the right thing to do to end them. A business culture that is blind to conflicts is a business culture that does not have the best interests of its customer in mind. Moreover, it is one that is not observing the spirit as well as the letter of the law. So it is time for Australia's financial services sector to remember its purpose and remember always that they are dealing with other people's money. It must focus on outcomes that it delivers to its customers. Accordingly, there must be a wholesale review by firms to identify, manage, and, if appropriate, remove conflicts. Only when this is done can the journey of rebuilding trust with our communities begin. In recent years, the Australian Parliament has banned commissions and other conflicted payments in financial advice. This was a recognition that the best way to deal with some conflicts was not to manage or disclose them, but to remove them altogether. This is an option that ASIC favours in relation to conflicted payments in advice. There can be no ambiguity in this. So I would strongly suggest that all financial services firms keep this in mind when considering how to deal with conflicts of interests arising from remuneration structures. We have, for example, in our report on mortgage broker remuneration, highlighted the desirability of removing at least some of the remuneration-related conflicts in this sector. I spoke recently about the regulatory structure in Australia's financial markets. I highlighted that this structure was not, very deliberately, designed as a police state. And whilst ASIC and our fellow financial regulators sit at the heart of the regulatory structure, the system was deliberately designed to have a number of regulatory mechanisms and a range of compliance agents in addition to the regulators themselves. This is the legislative framework in which we operate. This structure is designed to have as the first line of compliance the firms and companies themselves. This is not a theoretical construct, nor is it spin. It is the law of the land. But sadly, as we have seen from ASIC's own work and the work of the Royal Commission, this has not been observed by firms. I'm not one to quote legislation in speeches, but one provision stands out. and that is Section 912A of the Corporations Act. This important provision states, amongst other things, that licensed firms, and I quote, must take reasonable steps to ensure that its representatives comply with financial services laws. This is an important provision since our regulatory structure was deliberately and consciously designed so that employee representatives are not licensed. Nevertheless, too often I have observed that a large difference with what firms consider as their statutory obligation to take reasonable steps to ensure good behaviour of their representatives compared with the expectations of ASIC and, importantly, the expectations of the community. In addition to this obligation, firms are required by law to provide financial services, and I'm quoting, efficiently, honestly, and fairly, and they must comply with financial services law. So taking all of these obligations together, the first line responsibility for ensuring compliance and the fairness of the financial services provided rests with the firms themselves. They are a crucial compliance and regulatory agents in our system. This is the law. This is how our system was designed. And a firm's failure to live up to these obligations ultimately impacts on the effectiveness and fairness of the entire financial system. Of course, one of the fundamental roles of regulators is to intervene when firms fail in their first-line regulatory responsibilities and obligations. This is core to our mission. It is something we apply ourselves to every day. And let's also be held to account in this regard. Let's talk about our law enforcement outcomes in holding firms and people to account. Since 2011, more than 800 people have been banned from providing financial services or credit, and more than 390 people have been banned from being directors. And so far this financial year, we have banned over 100 people from providing financial services or credit. We have disqualified more than 40 people from being directors of companies. These bannings prevent individuals from engaging in misconduct again, and thereby these actions are ones that protect the community. And whilst the principal purpose of banning is protective, bannings also have a strong punitive impact on an individual's livelihood. To this end, they are an important deterrent tool. In addition to bannings, we have obtained 19 criminal convictions so far this financial year, and over 160 since 2011. ASIC has not shied away from bringing matters to court for civil penalties either. This financial year alone, we have obtained $35.1 million in civil penalties. And importantly for Australians, we have recovered more than $230 million in compensation from consumers this year, and over $1.7 billion since 2011. These are important outcomes which show that ASIC is determined to play its part in making sure our regulatory system works. And I am personally committed to using every inch of our powers and tools to get the outcomes that the community deserves. And whilst we have been trying to do our job, unfortunately, all too often, the firms who have failed in their first-line responsibilities have made matters worse by not cooperating with us and, in some unacceptable cases, have actually obstructed our work. These firms have not just failed in their first-line duty, they have jeopardized the entire regulatory structure. What's more, they have endangered the financial system they are meant to support. This cannot stand. Because if firms continue to fail to step up to their responsibilities and duties, the integrity of our regulatory structure and our entire financial system is undermined. I observed earlier that the Australian regulatory system was not constructed to license individuals performing financial services roles. Accordingly, for this regulatory setting to achieve fair, honest, and efficient outcomes, the people in finance need to refocus on building a highly professional and ethical mindset. And for this to occur, employing firms and the sector more broadly need to have as their gold standard professionalism. That is to ensure the competence and conscientiousness of their employees and their representatives. The industry needs to embrace professionalism both in terms of its structure, that is with professional standard-setting bodies, professional organisations, and credible professional disciplinary structures, and in its spirit, that is embedding professionalism in the culture of the employing organisations and in the broader sector that the entities operate in. Let me be clear. Our call for greater levels of professionalism is not an abrogation of our important regulatory role. We stand ready to deploy all the regulatory and enforcement tools available to us, something I'll turn to shortly. But what I want to emphasise is that the industry and the people working within it need to do more to support the proper functioning of the financial system and its regulation. They need to take a true, real, and accountable leadership role in promoting professionalism. Ultimately, the financial industry needs to demand more of itself and from the people working within it. Now, I want to say a few words about ASIC's role and our strategic planning. ASIC's crucial role in our regulatory structure, as well as its international reputation as a world-class regulator, were one of the key reasons why I joined ASIC. And, as I said when I arrived back in the country, ASIC's job requires it to be strategic as well as forceful. It must directly confront and respond to harms and misconduct in the financial sector. ASIC strives to do its job in the best way possible within the legislative framework and in the face of continual changes in the corporate landscape. And yes, we always need to be searching for ways to improve, especially new ways to be agile and strategic, to adapt and evolve as the circumstances change. Let me give you some recent examples of this. In recent years, ASIC has made remediation of poor outcomes for retail customers a priority. Since 2011, as I said before, we have secured $1.7 billion in compensation for consumers. We see it as crucial and as a priority that customers receive redress for the harm that they have suffered. In 2016, ASIC collected data on life insurance claims handling, identifying that some insurers had substantially higher decline rates than others. ASIC and APRA are working with the insurance sector to provide powerful information for consumers on claims outcomes. This will establish a new world-leading benchmark system for transparency and thus accountability in insurance. And as the nature of the financial system evolves through rapid technological change, the nature of misconduct we deal with is also evolving. Accordingly, we have increased our focus on technology-enabled offending, and just this week, we charged an IT consultant with a total of 115 offences for unauthorised access to data held in a computer, insider trading, and destroying or concealing records required by ASIC. And these are just a few of the many examples of how ASIC is responding to emerging challenges. As I said, ASIC always needs to critically evaluate its own performance. It embraced the recommendations made in the 2014 Senate inquiry into its performance, as well as the ASIC capability review in 2016. And we must continue to explore new ideas and new ways for us to work, especially via the adoption of new regulatory tools and approaches. Let me take you through some of the new approaches we are looking to deliver in the months and years ahead. First, enforcement. We have utilised funding from our enforcement special account over the last few years to fund a program that focuses on the financial advice sector. We call this our wealth management project, and it included a number of investigations on financial advice in large financial institutions. Much of what we saw in the financial advice round of the Royal Commission hearings was based on the work of this wealth management project. We need to accelerate and expand this intense program. And we are looking at ways how we can build on our substantial enforcement outcomes to date. This could include making greater use of external expertise in our investigations and our enforcement actions. This will help accelerate our response times and ensure ASIC continues to deliver strong enforcement results. The government has also announced it has accepted or agreed in principle to all of the recommendations of the task force that reviewed ASIC's enforcement powers. This is good news. These reforms include significantly stronger and clearer rules about the obligation of licensees to respond to breaches to ASIC honestly and in a timely manner. A stronger ability for ASIC to take regulatory action against senior managers or controllers of financial services business. A directions power that will enable us to direct licensees to take particular remedial actions, such as consumer compensation programs, and stronger penalties for licensees. For example, a breach of Section 912A that I just quoted about efficiently, honestly, and fairly currently does not incur a penalty. It would under the proposed reforms. These are reforms that ASIC has advocated for quite some time, and we are keen to work with government to progress them. At the same time, we want to ensure that we have the processes and capability in place to enforce these new powers as soon as they become available. Accordingly, I am very much looking forward to Mr. Daniel Crennan QC joining the ASIC team as our second Deputy Chair. Mr. Crennan will bring to ASIC valuable experience from both the legal bar and business that will further strengthen our enforcement leadership and capabilities. Next, I want to talk about a regulatory tool I have a lot of experience in: supervision. ASIC currently supervises firms it regulates through a combination of, firstly, risk-based surveillance that is aimed at a particular firm or transaction, for example, our surveillance of the ASX. And secondly, through thematic reviews which consider how a particular issue or problem is addressed in a sector. For example, our review of the impact of vertical integration in financial advice. Over the coming years, we will improve upon this work by adopting new supervisory approaches. For example, we are looking to apply a new supervisory focus on Australia's largest financial institutions and superannuation funds. This will involve more intensive and dedicated supervision with increased cooperation with our fellow regulators, especially APRA. The third new approach I want to highlight today is ASIC's role in encouraging the adoption of regulatory technology solutions in the financial sector. ASIC believes that Australia can position itself as a world leader in the development and adoption of RegTech solutions. These solutions will be key to overcoming the significant conduct challenges facing Australia's financial industry and have the potential to promote better consumer outcomes. For example, just think about the potential of near real-time and augmented human judgment supervision. We want to speed progress to this outcome. To this end, ASIC is already engaging with the RegTech and FinTech sectors to promote opportunities to collaborate and share information on RegTech. And we want to build on this momentum to find further ways to collaborate and assist with the development of these important new technologies. In closing, as always, the extent that we can develop these new initiatives will depend on our capability and our level of resourcing. It is accordingly highly relevant that this is the first year that our funding will be sourced from the industry itself. And as the Treasurer confirmed last week, ASIC is in the process of discussing with the government what additional support we need. My job is to ensure that ASIC does its job and also that it strategically responds to the prevailing circumstances. And in my current assessment of Australia's financial system, there is a real need for the new regulatory approaches I just mentioned. And I expect that there will be further initiatives necessary to enhance our regulatory approach for tomorrow's challenges. And of course, we await the recommendations that will come from the important work of the Royal Commission. Our job at ASIC is to continually evolve and improve what we do to meet the significant challenges confronting the financial system. We aim to do our job with professionalism and competence we expect of industry participants. And ultimately, our aim is a fair, strong, and efficient financial system for all Australians. The industry's job is to support and reinforce this, including in their first-line responsibilities. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's get on with it. Thank you. Shall I go there? Where do you want me, Liz?
That's fine.
Terrific.
Thank you very much, James. Now we have time for only a small number of questions, and I know that we've got some roving mics somewhere, so perhaps if people could be... We've got one down the front here, please. The mic is weaving its way to you, and if people could please give their name and organisation when they ask their question.
Mr Shipton, Elise Morgan from the ABC's The Business Program. When petty criminals commit crime, they generally go to jail and there's no negotiation. When financial institutions break the laws here and potentially steal millions or tens of millions of dollars of Australians' money, they've got to negotiate their penalties with ASIC through enforceable undertakings. Should this continue?
Thank you for the question. There is a very relevant debate to be had about any type of enforcement tool that we're utilising. One of the comments I will make about the enforceable undertaking is that it is a tool, an enforcement tool and mechanism that has delivered substantial amounts of compensation to consumers. And because it has delivered substantial amounts of compensation to consumers, which, as I mentioned in my remarks, is a priority for ASIC, it is a valuable tool to apply in different circumstances. I would also add that up until the announcement recently of our new enforcement powers. We actually had in Australia relatively restricted forms of enforcement penalties, including trying to seek compensation from customers. And in my experience, compared to other jurisdictions, that enforcement toolkit was narrow or too narrow. And we welcome, and I personally welcome, the government's decision to expand that regulatory toolkit so that we can expand the number and usage of different types of tools, including what you allude to, such as criminal or civil penalties. But I would not want to undermine the usefulness, the continual usefulness of enforceable undertakings, which deliver substantial amounts of compensation to consumers.
They've just got their money back, but only a couple of millions of dollars in essential fines that they've given to charity.
Thank you, but we'll move on to another question because I've got a whole room full of people wanting to ask questions. Over here, please.
It's Thomas Clark, UTS Business School. It's a follow-up, really, from Elisa's question. When Enron and WorldCom collapsed, we had Jay Lorch publish a book called Restoring Trust. After the global financial crisis, we had many discussions on restoring trust. And we've had the huge reform effort led by the Financial Stability Board and all of the national regulators worldwide. However, we've still found in the revelations of the Royal Commission that misconduct has continued. You've given us a tough talk, James, but it's whether it's tough enough. The fact is that many of the prosecutions you've mentioned and the fines you've mentioned have been the underbelly of the financial community. The big end of town, especially our big five financial institutions, have emerged relatively unscathed from everything they've done, and there is little reassurance that the continuation along a path where they're too big to fail, too big to manage, too big to regulate, and too big to jail.
You're absolutely right. There is a tremendous trust deficit. And what I've said today, I want you to hold me to account. I want ASIC to use every inch of the regulatory toolkit that is given to us. And this sort of cuts back on the earlier question. What I want to do is look forward. What I'm going to do as the new chair of ASIC and new to the Australian financial system is take all of the different tools that we have and look forward to deploying them as and when necessary, including civil, criminal, and other interventional type powers that we have. This is absolutely crucial. We have a problem right now. What I'm focused in on doing is, as I've just done, diagnose the issues, including a trust deficit, as you just mentioned, including the prevalence of conflicts of interest. Working with the government to acquire new tools so that we can respond appropriately. That's my focus. That's what I want to do. I want to utilize this tool set in a toolbox in a strategic, forceful manner so that we can solve the problems that we can clearly see now. And I welcome, as I said before, the government and the Australian Parliament legislating for these new tools, which will give us far more forceful mechanisms to address the problems that you've highlighted and I spoke about in the speech.
Mr. Shipton, Peter Ryan from the ABC. Thanks for taking my question. Some of the revelations out of the Royal Commission have been quite breathtaking. A lot of people have been shocked. You've mentioned in your speech that you do have concerns about how this goes to the integrity of the financial system. How serious is that threat, given what we've heard from the Royal Commission about the ethics and adherence to the law by some of our biggest financial institutions?
I think the threat is great. And as I mentioned before, as a former member of the finance profession, as a person who is proud to be a financier, I find it jarring and disappointing that this is the circumstances in which we find themselves. And as an Australian, as a proud Australian who is returning from nearly 25 years away, it's very confronting that we find ourselves in this situation. This is why I am committed, moving forward, to using every inch of our regulatory toolbox to address these problems. These issues must not stand. They must be addressed. And we will do, and I will do my part to address them.
One last question. Thank you,
Colin Long, I'm from a super fund, union representative on a super fund. Given the very fact of the Royal Commission and so on, to me that indicates a failure of ASIC in the first place. Is there any review of what ASIC has failed in over the last many years to regulate corporate sector?
Well, thank you very much for the question. I would definitely not say that ASIC has failed. A couple of observations. I've been watching ASIC with great admiration over many years from a distance. And I believe that they have been doing a fundamentally good job addressing the issues at hand. ASIC does not have the powers it needs. They will soon get the powers that they need. And secondly, we are talking about utilising and improving and applying new tools about the prevailing circumstances that we find ourselves in now. And as I mentioned in the speech, I think it's important to remind ourselves that the regulatory structure is not regulators alone. Yes, we have a fundamental and crucial role, but there is a role by the industry itself, by professional bodies, by entities, and they have not lived up to their end of the bargain. We will continue to try and live up to our end of the bargain. We will continue to be committed. And one thing I will observe, of 3 months of working with the fine men and women at ASIC, they are committed individuals. They want to solve the problems that you and the community now clearly see. They are committed and dedicated. And I think, and in fact I have, every confidence with a strategic mindset, with the new powers that we have, with the morale and the motivation of the men and women of ASIC and the support of industry bodies like this one, and men and women in this room who are important stewards of assets, that we can actually make effective change and can make a difference. I'm committed to doing my part. I would call on each and every one of you to do your part to make sure that the things that we are seeing in the Royal Commission hearings and that you can read about in our reports and our press releases do not stand into the future.
Thank you very much, James.